There is a specific, quiet blindness that afflicts small towns and isolated valleys and close-knit communities where everyone knows your name but nobody truly knows your heart. An assumption that the truly spectacular things in life must always arrive wrapped in bright colors and announced by loud, deafening declarations. And so the people look to the horizon for fireworks and completely ignore the bedrock beneath their very boots. In the sprawling, time-forgotten town of Oakhaven, this blindness was not just a habit, but a generations-old tradition, woven into the very fabric of the humid summer air and the frost-bitten winter mornings, where the collective mindset held firmly to the belief that greatness was a thing you imported, not a thing you grew. And living right in the dead center of this collective oversight was Elias, a man built entirely out of calluses and early mornings, and faded denim and steady, unshakable hands. A man who possessed the kind of grounded, hyper-competent grace that went entirely unnoticed by those who confused volume for value. Elias was the town's mechanic, its carpenter, its silent guardian of broken things, spending his days covered in a fine layer of motor oil and sawdust, moving through his life with a deliberate, rhythmic, and unhurried pacing that mimicked the slow, natural passage of time itself. He did not speak much, preferring the blunt, undeniable honesty of a repaired engine or a perfectly leveled doorframe to the flowery, empty promises that other men tossed around the local tavern. And observing him from across the dusty expanse of the town square was Clara, a woman of sharp eyes and steadfast resolve, and an intellect that cut through the daily gossip like a freshly whetted scythe through dry summer wheat. Clara ran the general store and its attached bakery, keeping the ledgers with an exacting precision and baking bread with a fierce, quiet devotion that anchored the town's mornings in the smell of yeast and wood smoke. She was observant, taking in the world with a patient, calculating stillness, slow to act but utterly unshakable once a decision had finally settled in her bones, and she watched Elias with a gaze that stripped away the dirt and the grease to see the pure, unpretentious machinery of his character. The town assumed Clara was simply a spinster waiting for a wealthy merchant or a loud, charismatic politician to sweep her away from her flour-dusted counters, a dryly humorous and entirely flawed assumption that she never bothered to correct because she found their lack of self-awareness endlessly amusing. She knew what she wanted, and she knew that human traits were much like the surrounding landscapes, where the flashy men were merely spring thunderstorms, loud and destructive and quickly gone, while Elias was the mountain itself, silent and enduring and capable of surviving the harshest winters without ever asking for a word of praise. He showed up, day after day, year after year, a constant, heavy presence in a world of fleeting shadows, and Clara recognized that showing up was the only thing that actually mattered when the storm finally broke. And so began the slow, agonizing, and beautiful dance of two overlooked, fiercely capable people existing in parallel, separated by 100 feet of cobblestone and a mountain of unspoken devotion, perfectly aligned in their mutual understanding of the world but trapped by the quiet, heavy, dramatic weight of their own ordinary lives. The routine of their days settled into a deeply entrenched, rhythmic pattern that echoed the turning of the seasons, the harsh and unforgiving passage of time acting as a silent antagonist that threatened to bury their unspoken feelings beneath a mountain of mundane, daily labors. Elias would wake before the sun had even considered cresting the eastern ridge, his boots hitting the scuffed wooden floorboards of his cabin with a heavy, purposeful thud, and he would begin the ritual of brewing black, bitter coffee while the rest of the world remained locked in the blissful ignorance of sleep. He would step out onto his porch, feeling the cold morning mist clinging to his flannel shirt, and his eyes would inevitably, instinctively drift toward the chimney of Clara's bakery across the valley, looking for the thin, wispy trail of gray smoke that signaled she was already awake, already working, already existing in the same quiet, solitary universe that he inhabited. When he saw the smoke, a profound, heavy warmth would settle in his chest, a wordless validation that he was not entirely alone in the dark, and he would set off toward his garage, his hands itching to find purpose in the unyielding metal of broken transmissions and shattered engine blocks. Clara, meanwhile, would stand before her massive, flour-dusted wooden prep tables, her hands moving with a hyper-competent, unhurried grace, kneading dough with the steady, rhythmic persistence of a river carving its way through a canyon of solid stone. She would occasionally pause, wiping a stray strand of hair from her damp forehead with the back of her wrist, and look out the frost-edged window just in time to see Elias pulling up the heavy, rusted metal door of his shop, the harsh screech of the hinges carrying across the empty square like a secret, metallic greeting meant only for her. The town of Oakhaven would slowly wake around them, filling the spaces between their quiet actions with the loud, performative display of ordinary community life. The neighbors shouting greetings and haggling over prices and spreading the dry, understated gossip of who had offended whom at the previous Sunday's service. Old Man Miller would invariably complain about his tractor, and Mrs. Gable would inevitably lament the state of the roads, all of them entirely blind to the epic, poetic romance that was playing out in the spaces where no words were ever spoken. Elias and Clara existed in a state of continuous, deliberate observation, stripping away the flowery language of traditional courtship in favor of a blunt, honest attention to detail, learning the intricate, unseen topography of each other's habits. Elias knew exactly how long it took for Clara's first batch of sourdough to hit the cooling racks, and Clara knew the precise, metallic clink of Elias's favorite wrench hitting the concrete floor when a particularly stubborn bolt finally gave way. They communicated in the silent, heavy language of shared competence, valuing the quiet action of a job well done over the loud, boastful posturing that defined the lesser men of the town, their unspoken devotion building tension through protracted, agonizingly slow near misses, and the heavy, melancholic realization that another day had passed without either of them daring to bridge the devastatingly short distance between the bakery and the garage. The first palpable shift in the heavy, atmospheric air of their unspoken dynamic occurred on a blistering, unforgiving Tuesday in late August, when the ancient, cast-iron dough mixer in the back of Clara's bakery finally surrendered to the ravages of time, seizing up with a violent, agonizing screech that echoed through the quiet shop like a dying animal. Clara stood over the broken machinery, her jaw set in a tight, unshakable line, refusing to give in to the panic that would have consumed a lesser baker, and she simply wiped the excess flour from her apron, walked out the front door, and marched directly across the blindingly bright, sun-baked cobblestones of the town square toward Elias's garage. The local gossips, gathered on the shaded porch of the post office, watched her swift, purposeful progress with a dryly humorous mix of confusion and collective, flawed assumption, whispering among themselves that Clara was finally going to demand that Elias move his noisy scrap trucks away from her pristine storefront, completely misreading the profound emotional undercurrent of the moment. Clara stepped into the cool, oil-scented gloom of the garage, the shadows wrapping around her like a heavy cloak, and found Elias buried waist-deep beneath the rusted chassis of a logging truck, his powerful arms coated in a dark, shimmering layer of grease and grime. The mixer seized, she said, her voice sparse, direct, and heavily layered with subtext, stripping away any need for pleasantries or flowery introductions, presenting the problem with the blunt honesty of a woman who knew exactly who she was talking to. Elias did not startle, nor did he ask unnecessary questions. He simply slid out from under the truck, wiped his enormous, calloused hands on a red shop rag, and grabbed his heavy leather tool belt, mirroring her unadorned directness by stating, "Show me the mixer." They walked back across the square together in a tense, quiet procession, their strides perfectly aligned, ignoring the invasive, speculative stares of the townspeople who could not fathom the quiet, intense gravity of this simple, practical interaction. Inside the bakery, Elias approached the broken machine with a quiet, reverent focus, dismantling the heavy iron casing with a hyper-competent, surgical precision, his hands moving with an innate understanding of gears and grease and tension, while Clara stood silently by his side, handing him the exact tools he needed before he even had to ask for them. It was a breathtaking, intimate display of mirrored actions and mutual understanding, a silent, deeply rooted partnership manifesting in the simple act of repairing a broken gear, their bodies moving in a deliberate, unhurried rhythm that made the suffocating heat of the bakery feel entirely inconsequential. When he finally reassembled the machine and flipped the heavy electrical switch, the mixer roared back to life with a smooth, even hum, and Elias wiped his brow, turning to look at Clara with a gaze that held 100 unspoken promises, while she simply nodded, the deepest form of gratitude conveyed without a single wasted syllable, their connection solidifying like cooling iron. From that blistering August afternoon forward, the nature of their relationship shifted into a new, heavily layered phase of quiet, unspoken gestures, weaving a tapestry of profound emotional connection out of the coarse, ordinary threads of their daily labor. The passage of time continued its relentless, antagonistic march, turning the sweltering heat of summer into the crisp, dying amber of autumn, and then plunging the town of Oakhaven into the deep, isolating freeze of a brutal winter. But the cold only served to emphasize the deep warmth that was slowly, steadily building between the mechanic and the baker. Elias, acutely aware of the drafty, rattling windows in the front of Clara's store, took it upon himself to show up long after the town had gone to sleep, standing on a battered wooden ladder in the freezing, snow-swept darkness to carefully, meticulously caulk every single pane of glass, ensuring the bitter wind could no longer bite at her shoulders while she worked. He did not leave a note, and he did not seek a word of thanks. He simply did the work because showing up and providing shelter was the fundamental nature of his character, a literal manifestation of his protective, steadfast spirit. Clara, arriving the next morning to a shop that was miraculously, beautifully warm, immediately recognized the clean, precise lines of new caulk, and she knew without a shadow of a doubt whose hands had labored in the freezing dark to bring her comfort. In response, she began leaving a small, unassuming brown paper bag on the rusted metal barrel just outside his garage door every morning, containing a single, perfectly baked, still warm apple pastry and a heavy ceramic thermos of bitter, black coffee, mirroring his quiet provision with her own unpretentious, fiercely honest form of care. Elias would find the bag, the heat of the thermos seeping through the thick leather of his work gloves, and he would stand in the snow, looking across the square at her frosted window, his heart clenching with a tense, quiet yearning that was so sharp and so profound it threatened to crack his ribs. They were speaking volumes to one another without ever parting their lips, their actions ringing louder than any shouted declaration from the town square, building a fortress of mutual reliance that the rest of the community remained entirely oblivious to, blinded by their own collective inability to recognize love when it was wearing work boots and an apron. The gossips continued to chatter, assuming Elias was just a lonely, stubborn bachelor destined to die under a rusty truck, and Clara was just a fiercely independent woman too rigid to ever soften for a man, entirely missing the poetry of the warm bakery and the perfectly sealed windows. It was a dry, understated comedy of errors on the part of the town, serving only to highlight the vast, unbridgeable chasm between the superficial judgments of the many and the deep, intrinsic, hyper-competent understanding shared solely by the two of them, standing strong as mountains amidst a sea of fleeting, irrelevant weather patterns. Yet, despite the deep warmth and the profound relief they found in their shared, silent routines, Elias was plagued by a heavy, agonizing internal struggle, deeply rooted in his fundamental belief that he was, at his core, merely a pedestrian, unremarkable man entirely unworthy of Clara's brilliant, sharp-edged light. As the harsh winter began to thaw into the muddy, hesitant beginnings of spring, Elias found himself spending long, solitary hours in the suffocating darkness of his garage, his hands mechanically rebuilding a carburetor while his mind relentlessly, brutally dissected his own perceived inadequacies. He possessed a godlike view of every moving part in an engine, but when he turned that omniscient gaze inward, he saw only a man covered in perpetual grime, a man who lacked the flowery language, the sophisticated education, and the performative, charismatic display that he assumed a woman of Clara's extraordinary intellect and grace rightfully deserved. He compared himself to the traveling salesman who occasionally passed through Oakhaven, Men with crisp, tailored suits and smooth, polished voices. Men who could effortlessly string together polysynthetic praises and grand, sweeping promises that sounded like music but lacked any actual, structural weight. "I am just a mechanic," Elias would mutter to the empty, oil-stained walls, the rhythmic, deliberate pacing of his words echoing the slow, steady drip of rain through his corrugated tin roof. "I fix what is broken, and I sweep the floor, and I go to sleep, and that is all I am." He felt the relentless passage of time pressing down on him, whispering that he was running out of years to become something greater, something spectacular, completely failing to realize that his unwavering reliability, his quiet action, and his unshakable steadfastness were exactly the epic, folklore-like traits that made him a giant among ordinary men. He was a mountain apologizing for not being a firework, a river cursing itself for not being a sudden, violent flood, entirely unaware that Clara stood across the square watching his steady, unyielding presence with a profound, uplifting gratitude that bordered on absolute reverence. This internal tension, this tense, quiet yearning mixed with deep-seated insecurity, paralyzed Elias, creating a protracted, agonizing series of near misses where he would gather the courage to walk across the square, only to stop halfway, defeated by the heavy, suffocating weight of his own unpretentious humility. He would turn back to his tools, letting the strategic pause stretch into another day, another week, another month, silently demanding of himself that he somehow magically transform into a different kind of man before he dared to ask Clara to truly see him, blind to the fact that she had already seen him, completely and utterly, since the very first day. He did not know that Clara despised the traveling salesman and their empty, polished words, finding their loud, performative displays to be nothing more than the hollow rattling of cheap, poorly manufactured tin, utterly lacking the dense, gravitational pull of a man who simply kept his promises and did the hard, unglamorous work. Elias's profound lack of self-awareness regarding his own monumental worth was a tragic, quietly dramatic irony that saturated his every movement, turning his noble, silent devotion into a self-imposed prison of isolation and deeply unwarranted shame. He believed his calluses were a disqualification from love, completely oblivious to the reality that Clara viewed those very calluses as the only authentic proof of a man capable of anchoring her soul in a chaotic, unpredictable world. Across the muddy expanse of the town square, Clara was fighting her own quiet, deeply internal battle, navigating the frustrating, agonizing space between her steadfast patience and the sudden, overwhelming desire to finally shatter the silence that had grown so heavy and thick between them. The town of Oakhaven was preparing for its annual Spring Jubilee, a loud, chaotic, and entirely performative community gathering designed to celebrate the end of the frost, filled with bright banners and out-of-tune brass bands and the exhausting, collective requirement to smile and engage in meaningless, flowery small talk. Clara hated the Jubilee with a dry, understated passion, finding the collective enthusiasm to be a hollow, exhausting performance. Yet she found herself meticulously ironing her only good dress, a simple, deep navy fabric that mirrored the twilight sky, her thoughts entirely consumed by the desperate, intense hope that Elias might finally step out of his garage and join the crowd. She stood before her mirror, her observant, hyper-competent mind zooming from the macro reality of the loud, bustling town outside her window to the micro, intimate flutter of her own fiercely guarded heart, realizing with a blunt, undeniable honesty that she was tired of waiting for the mountain to come to her. "He is stubborn," she whispered to the quiet room, her voice steady and rhythmic, echoing the deadpan acknowledgement of a woman who knew the exact, unyielding nature of the man she loved. "He is stubborn, and he is blind, and he thinks he is not enough, and he will wait until the end of the world if I do not force his hand." When the evening of the Jubilee finally arrived, the town square was awash in the warm, golden glow of strung lanterns and the chaotic, overlapping noise of fiddles and laughter, a swirling storm of community celebration that Clara navigated with a polite, distant grace, her eyes constantly searching the shadows at the edge of the light. And there he was, standing just beyond the reach of the lanterns, leaning against the heavy wooden post of the livery stable, his arms crossed over a clean but faded canvas jacket, his face an unreadable mask of quiet yearning and deeply rooted hesitation. Clara began to walk toward him, her steps deliberate and unhurried, slicing through the crowd of gossiping neighbors and dancing couples like a ghost, her entire being focused on the undeniable, magnetic pull of his presence, preparing to strip away the years of subtext and finally speak the raw, unadorned truth. But as she closed the distance, the loud, booming voice of the town mayor suddenly interrupted, demanding the attention of the crowd for a lengthy, flowery toast, and the physical surge of the gathered townspeople inadvertently pushed Clara backward, severing the sight line and breaking the fragile, atmospheric tension. When the crowd finally parted again, Elias was gone, retreating back into the safety of his solitary garage, leaving Clara standing alone under the lanterns, her fists clenched in quiet frustration, the passage of time marking yet another near miss in their slow burn, agonizingly beautiful tragedy of unspoken devotion. The breaking point did not arrive wrapped in the bright, festive colors of the Jubilee, nor did it announce itself with the cheerful, communal fanfare that the town of Oak Haven believed was necessary for monumental life events. Instead, it rolled over the valley in the form of a violent, merciless, and terrifying late spring storm. The sky bruised a deep, unnatural purple just after midday, the heavy, humid air suddenly dropping by 10 degrees as the wind began to howl with the furious, destructive energy of a cornered beast, sending the gossiping townspeople scattering into their homes and locking their doors against the impending wrath of nature. Clara was in the bakery, her hands deep in a massive mound of dough, when the first deafening crack of thunder shook the very foundations of the building, rattling her perfectly sealed windows and violently extinguishing the fragile, flickering electrical lights that hung from her high ceiling. Outside, the rain began to fall in heavy, driving sheets, turning the cobblestone square into a raging, chaotic river within minutes, washing away the superficial dust and grime of the town, and leaving behind only the stark, undeniable bedrock of survival and necessity. Suddenly, a massive, rotting oak branch from the tree overhanging the store snapped under the brutal force of the wind, crashing violently onto the roof of the bakery's front porch, tearing through the wooden shingles and exposing the vulnerable, wooden framing beneath to the torrential, unforgiving deluge. Clara stood in the darkness, her heart hammering against her ribs, her hyper-competent mind quickly assessing the damage, and realizing with a cold, terrifying certainty that if the porch roof gave way, the front windows would shatter, and the storm would entirely destroy her shop, her livelihood, and the sanctuary she had built with her own 2 hands. She grabbed a heavy iron pry bar and a thick coil of rope, rushing out into the blinding, freezing rain, the storm stripping away her usual pristine, unshakable composure, leaving her battling the ferocious elements in a desperate, deeply profound struggle to save the ordinary, beautiful life she had carved out of the valley. And then, cutting through the roaring, chaotic noise of the storm like a beacon of pure, unwavering salvation, came Elias, running across the flooded square without a coat, his boots splashing heavily in the rising water, carrying a massive canvas tarp and a heavy sledgehammer, entirely ignoring the danger to himself. He did not yell over the wind, and he did not ask if she needed help. He simply arrived, stepping into the breach with his unyielding, grounded strength, taking the heavy rope from her freezing hands and moving with the fierce, capable determination of a man defending his own heart. They worked together in the blinding, torrential downpour, their movements perfectly synchronized, entirely wordless, relying on the deep, intrinsic connection they had built over years of quiet observation, securing the tarp and bracing the roof with a raw, desperate energy that elevated their everyday labor into an epic, cinematic display of absolute, unquestionable devotion. The storm raged against them, treating them as if they were mere mortals daring to defy the gods. But together, standing shoulder to shoulder in the freezing mud, they proved themselves to be an immovable force, an unshakable partnership forged in the fires of necessity and the cold, hard reality of an unforgiving world. When the storm finally broke, leaving behind a profound, dripping silence, and a town bathed in the pale, silver light of a newly emerged moon. Elias and Clara stood in the wreckage of the porch, utterly exhausted, soaked to the bone, and shivering in the damp, heavy night air. The adrenaline that had fueled their frantic, hyper-competent labor suddenly evaporated, leaving behind a raw, unshielded vulnerability that hung in the quiet space between them, thick and heavy and impossible to ignore, demanding that the years of protracted, agonizing subtext finally be stripped away. Clara dropped her heavy iron pry bar onto the wet wooden floorboards with a dull, resonant thud, her chest heaving, her dark hair plastered to her face, and she looked up at Elias, her sharp, observant eyes burning with a fierce, quiet intensity that pinned him firmly to the spot. Elias looked down at his massive, calloused hands, covered in fresh scrapes and old grease and the chilling mud of the storm. The heavy, melancholic weight of his own perceived ordinariness crashing down upon him once more, threatening to force him back into the agonizing silence he had lived in for so long. He let out a long, shuddering breath, the exhalation carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies and a lifetime of profound, deeply ingrained insecurity, and he finally spoke, his voice sparse, blunt, and rough as unpolished stone. "Clara," he started, the single word hanging in the air. "I don't have grand speeches, and I don't have wealth, and I don't know how to be the kind of spectacular man they write stories about." He paused, a strategic, devastating pause that seemed to stop the very rotation of the earth, his eyes dropping to the flooded cobblestones as he surrendered to the blunt, brutal honesty of his own limitations. "I sighed," he murmured, the sound blending with the rhythmic dripping of rainwater from the eaves. "I'm just a regular guy." The words were a quiet, dramatic admission of defeat, a surrender to the collective assumption of the town. But Clara did not look away, nor did she offer a flowery, empty reassurance. Instead, she stepped forward, entirely eliminating the physical and emotional distance that had separated them for years. She reached out, her damp, flour-stained hands gripping his muddy, calloused fingers with an unyielding, steadfast strength, stripping away the last remnants of his fear with the profound, uplifting power of a woman who had found exactly what she was searching for. And she smiled, a genuine, brilliant, and fiercely honest expression that pierced through the gloomy aftermath of the storm, her voice a sweeping, lyrical melody as she delivered the unadorned truth. "Elias," she said, echoing his directness, her mirrored dialogue reinforcing their perfect, unwavering alignment. "That's exactly what I've been looking for." In that single, breathtaking moment, the vast, agonizing chasm of their protracted near misses completely collapsed inward, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming rush of pure, unadulterated relief and deep, structural warmth that radiated straight through their freezing, rain-soaked bodies. Elias stared at her, his mind struggling to process the monumental reality that his ordinary, unpretentious nature was not a burden to be tolerated, but the very prize she had coveted above all the flashy, loud, and spectacular things the world had to offer. He realized, with a profound, earth-shattering clarity, that he did not need to be a thunderstorm to be loved by her. He only ever needed to be the mountain, steady, present, and unconditionally there. The immediate aftermath of that rainy, unadorned confession was not marked by a sudden, cinematic surge of passionate theatrics or the loud, chaotic celebrations that the gossips of Oakhaven would have undoubtedly expected, but rather by a deep, resonant settling of their souls, a quiet, profound relief that washed over them like the gentle, cleansing current of a slow-moving river. They did not run through the streets declaring their love, nor did they change the fundamental, grounded nature of who they were. Instead, Elias simply pulled Clara into his arms, wrapping his heavy, canvas-clad frame around her shivering shoulders, pressing his face into her damp hair, and holding her with the fierce, protective devotion of a man who had finally brought his most precious treasure safely home. They stood there in the wreckage, surrounded by shattered shingles and pooled rainwater, completely indifferent to the chaos around them, rooted in the deep, unshakable satisfaction of an earned, hard-fought partnership that had been tested by time and weather and doubt and had emerged entirely unbroken. The following morning, the town of Oakhaven slowly woke to assess the damage from the storm, the neighbors stepping cautiously out onto their porches, expecting to find Clara's bakery in ruins and Elias hidden away in his garage, only to be met with a sight that fundamentally shattered their collective, flawed assumptions. They found Elias standing proudly on the roof of the bakery in the bright, crisp morning light, his hammer swinging in a steady, rhythmic cadence as he effortlessly repaired the broken framing, while Clara stood below on the porch, handing him fresh nails and smiling with a quiet, radiant warmth that no one in the town had ever seen before. The local gossips, including Old Man Miller and Mrs. Gable, gathered near the post office, their jaws practically hitting the wet cobblestones as they watched the mechanic and the baker interact with the effortless, heavily layered intimacy of two people who had known each other's souls for 1,000 years. It was a dry, understated comedy to watch the town slowly, painfully realize that the epic romance they had always been searching for in the grand, sweeping gestures of visiting strangers had been quietly, persistently building right under their very noses, forged in the smell of motor oil and baking bread. No one dared to interrupt them, instinctively recognizing the elevated, poetic reverence of the moment, watching as Elias climbed down the ladder, wiped his brow, and leaned in to press a soft, unhurried kiss to Clara's forehead, a simple, ordinary action that carried the weight and majesty of a crowned king claiming his throne. They had stripped away the necessity for an audience, proving that true, monumental love does not require a stage or a spotlight. It merely requires two hyper-competent, fiercely devoted people willing to show up, day after day, and build a shelter together against the inevitable storms of life. The blindness of Oakhaven was finally cured in that bright morning sun, their collective mindset irrevocably altered by the profound, quiet drama of Elias and Clara's union, an undeniable testament to the fact that the most spectacular things in existence are often the most common, ordinary things, simply observed with the right kind of eyes and held with the right kind of steadfast, unwavering hands. Years rolled forward, sweeping over the valley of Oakhaven with the relentless, unyielding passage of time, turning the bright, fiery summers into long, quiet winters, and slowly painting the dark hair of the mechanic and the baker with the soft, distinguished frost of old age, yet the deep, structural warmth of their partnership only grew more profound and unshakable. The town eventually forgot the details of the storm, and the gossips moved on to fresh scandals and new arrivals. But the sight of Elias and Clara walking across the town square together, their hands quietly, inextricably linked, became a fixed, immovable part of the local folklore, an atmospheric, almost mythological standard of devotion that the younger generations looked upon with a quiet, breathless reverence. Elias never became a man of flowery speeches, and he never learned to grandstand or boast, but he continued to meticulously caulk the windows, and he continued to keep the engines running, and he continued to show up every single day, proving his love in the blunt, honest language of repaired floorboards and perfectly maintained machinery. Clara, her sharp intellect and observant nature only deepening into a profound, gentle wisdom, never stopped leaving the brown paper bag of coffee and pastries on his workbench, her steadfast loyalty anchoring their shared life in a rhythm of mutual care that rendered the harsh, antagonistic march of time completely irrelevant. They lived a life devoid of performative display, an existence entirely composed of quiet actions, mirrored gestures, and the deeply satisfying knowledge that they were completely, utterly seen by the only person whose vision actually mattered. And so, we look upon their story not as a grand, fiery tragedy or a loud, explosive fairy tale, but as an earnest, contemplative reminder to the world that the bedrock is infinitely more valuable than the firework, and that the greatest, most enduring romances are not found in the chaotic pursuit of the extraordinary, but in the fierce, unrelenting dedication to the ordinary. For when a man who believes he is nothing but a regular guy meets a woman who recognizes that a regular, honest, and steadfast guy is the rarest and most spectacular phenomenon in the entire universe, The resulting collision does not make a sound, but it quietly, permanently shifts the very axis of the earth. They built a fortress out of simple, working-class wood and ordinary, unspectacular stone, and inside that fortress, insulated from the loud, superficial noise of the outside world, they found an epic, lyrical, and sweeping peace, proving forever that showing up, in all your unadorned, beautifully average glory, is the most heroic, godlike thing a human being can possibly do. They sat on their rebuilt porch in the twilight of their lives, watching the sun dip behind the mountains that Elias so closely resembled, the air heavy with the scent of yeast and rain and aged pine, entirely content in the vast, beautiful silence they had cultivated. He would look at her, his calloused thumb gently brushing the back of her wrinkled hand, the tension and quiet yearning of their youth entirely replaced by a deep, uplifting gratitude that had settled permanently into his bones, knowing he had never needed to be anything more than exactly what he was. And Clara would smile back, her sharp eyes still shining with that same fierce, unshakable truth, the silent, omnipresent narrator of their shared history whispering the final, indisputable moral of their tale to anyone wise enough to listen. That the spectacular is merely an illusion, but the ordinary, when loved fiercely and held tightly, is absolutely eternal.